Thanks so much to you, Bill, and everybody at HCI for having me here for another conference. I think it's my fifth or sixth one at this point. I really enjoy speaking for you all. As Bill mentioned, Sarah Devereaux, hi. I'm coming to you from beautiful Ann Arbor, Michigan. We are in the prime of our fall color right now, which has just been fabulous. And we're also in the prime of fall cold and flu season. So pardon me, I have a nice cup of hot tea. My daughter, who's in elementary school, brought home a cold. So hopefully my voice will hang on. So let me know if at any point I need to repeat anything here. But as Bill mentioned, former Googler, head of strategic initiatives for the Google School of Leaders. That was my final role at Google. But before that, I was the head of executive development programs. So leading up all of our curriculum for directors and VPs and senior VPs, as well as the global head of G2G, which is the Googler to Googler network. That's a volunteer peer-to-peer community network that has expanded to about 11,000, 12,000 employees at this stage across the entire company and across the globe. So big community effort, which was just wonderful and such a crowning jewel, I would say, in my Google career, and having a better understanding of employee engagement and how to motivate people, like truly motivate them. Spent 14 years at Google and then moved on to lead my own coaching and advisory and consulting business, Third Coast Coaching. And then also, as Bill mentioned, started working at this startup by a guy that wrote a book, Aaron Dignan, Brave New Work, and really thinking about how we can make work wonderful through better, more inclusive, more collaborative decision making. So that's been really fun to go from facilitation and thinking about learning and development and decisioning and team dynamics as a practitioner to thinking about it in the context of building software. But today, I'm here to talk to you about burnout, which is a topic that I care about deeply and something that I've spent a ton of time thinking about, researching, and honestly do probably the vast majority of my coaching business focuses around burnout. So today we're specifically going to talk about the causes of burnout and why individual actions aren't effective in addressing it. Then we'll discuss how organizations can create systemic change to build a sustainable and safe working environment that's honestly, quite simply, inhospitable to burnout. So how do you build an environment where burnout just can't flourish? It can't thrive. And then finally, we're going to touch on where the conversation is going next about burnout and what levers leaders can pull to shift organizational mindsets surrounding burnout. Okay. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Slides work. So I want to start and just talk a little bit about my own experience with burnout. So if I'm really being honest, in my 14 years at Google, I probably experienced burnout like dozens of times. Not everyone was what I would say a full-scale episode where I needed to take months off to recover. I had a couple of those. But I would find myself tired, demotivated, and counting down the days to my next vacation on a pretty regular basis. And this was particularly prevalent during the years that I spent as a manager and a leader. That was 12 out of my 14. At Google, and I'm sure this is true elsewhere, and I've seen this with a lot of my clients outside of Google, leaders had such huge expectations on their shoulders. We were expected to drive performance by being exceptional coaches and technical mentors for our teams. We were expected to build trust and create safe environments and handle interpersonal conflict. And honestly, in the early days, there was really almost no guidance or training about how to do all that stuff. You were just supposed to know how to do it. They slapped the word manager on your title or senior, and you were expected to be able to handle all of that stuff. We also were expected to craft high-level strategies, and still be super familiar with what was happening down in the weeds so that we could give updates on literally anything at any moment, right? And then of course there's directly executing on a handful of projects. That's the age-old struggle of a leader or a manager, which I personally think really leads to leader and manager burnout is having to focus on the output and the success of your team, but also really still being an individual contributor and still having to carry a handful or maybe several handfuls worth of individual projects and staying up on what's happening in the industry. It's a ton, right? And no matter how much I was doing, it constantly felt like I wasn't good enough, that it wasn't enough, that I had to do more, and I had to do more with less. So after a few years, the individual actions that I would take to really recharge just weren't working anymore. Or how many massages I got. And trust me, it was a lot of massages. I probably could have bought a second house with the amount that I took advantage of the Google massage program. Nothing I did really had a sustainable effect. There's a recent study out by the McKinsey Health Institute that we're going to talk a little bit about later. And one of my favorite quotes from it is, "You can't yoga yourself out of this." And honestly, I was at that point. I could not yoga myself out of this. Like, something had to change. And I realized, towards the end of my time at Google and certainly afterwards, that the way that I was feeling, this lack of energy, that constant feeling of falling further and further behind, I really didn't call it burnout at the time. It was just, you're tired, you've got too much on your plate, you need to better manage your time. There's all these things that you should be doing better, right? In the way that you're structuring how you're executing. But I really thought that it was a personal failing. And I realized afterwards that it wasn't. And it was commonplace then, and it's becoming even more commonplace now, and especially more known now that we have some language around it and we can actually talk about what's happening for people. So let's take a look at the current reality that we're in. Burnout is rising, with 52% of all workers reporting feeling at least somewhat burnout. And this statistic is likely underreported. I talked about burnout a little bit at a separate conference earlier this year, and that number was 49% to look at all of 2021. For 2020, it was 42%. So we've gone up, 10 percentage points just in the last 18 months or so. And the thing that I find really concerning about this number is not the number itself. It's that the number is probably more like 70 or 75 because there is still a stigma. We have more language around this. There's more acceptance of the fact that people are burnout, but there is still a stigma about saying, I'm struggling, I'm burnt out, I'm having trouble. And so these numbers are likely much, much higher. Employees are leaving their jobs at an alarming rate, with 40% of workers considering a move and at least 50% of workers, right, engaging in quiet quitting, which I'm happy to talk about later in questions. Colleague Cafe, I absolutely despise that term because I think it makes it sound like setting boundaries is somehow not okay, but people are retreating back from putting a ton of extra effort into their jobs. And that's also a sign of I need to do something different because the way that I've been working isn't sustainable. I'm burnt out. And then finally, workplace toxicity is the leading cause of burnout and employee intent to leave, yet most companies continue to focus on training and benefits to solve the problem. I think the picture here is pretty clear. A recent article in The Guardian went so far as to label this the age of the burnout epidemic. And I honestly can't disagree with that terminology. Employees are tired. They feel isolated and lonely, and they're fed up with manipulative managers and organizational politics. I suppose you could try to explain some of these trends along generational lines, and there are so many articles that I've read recently that have tried to do that. But the data suggests that even though Gen Z might be louder, the unrelenting exhaustion associated with burnout knows no age limit. Workers are tired, full stop. And they're done asking, right? They're done asking for something better. They're done trying to influence without authority. They're literally demanding something that's different and more meaningful when it comes to work, and that takes them into account as a whole human beings who have needs, right? Like outside of organizational metrics and outcomes. And I believe, as dramatic, I guess, as this may sound, I believe that if these demands aren't met, the Great Resignation, quiet quitting, quiet firing, and now quick quitting won't be the last of employee disengagement trends to surface. People will continue to rebel against the status quo until the root cause of burnout is addressed. And leaders who stick to the script and refuse to change the underlying fabric of how their organizations function, they're going to bear the brunt of the fallout. So, with that sunny picture as context, let's talk a little bit about how burnout affects performance, because addressing burnout, it really matters, but it doesn't just matter because we want to keep people in their jobs. We also want to keep them engaged and performing in their jobs, right? Not everybody quits, like outright. Some people retreat and stay in their positions, or some people work 3 engineering jobs at the same time and do the minimum required in order to get through their day. There's this wonderful neuro coach who I follow. Her name is Kashawn Hughes, and she talks about the effects that burnout has on our brains and how that translates into issues on the job. In terms of brain chemistry, burnout simultaneously weakens our right brain, where our intuition, emotional literacy, and creativity lives, and it overactivates our left brain, which leads to more linear thinking and also causes us to produce more of the stress hormones like cortisol that weaken our immune system. As a result, we often demonstrate some pretty serious performance gaps when we burn out. We have difficulty learning because our memory and attention spans are weakened. We tend to demonstrate outsized emotions when changes to our amygdala cause us to react aggressively under stress. Or when we feel challenged, right? When we feel like we're being attacked. We also tend to make bad decisions, or at least worse decision. Our decision-making is impaired because the part of our brain responsible for empathy, judgment, impulse control has literally shrunk. So I want to just pause on that takeaway for just a second. If there's one thing that you remember from our talk today, I hope it's that burnout shrinks our brains. Literally, physically, scientifically, burnout is making our brains smaller. And as the stats on the previous slide illustrated, this situation is only getting worse. But before we talk about what to do about it, I want to talk for a minute about the primary causes of burnout. So what's actually fueling all of this? There's a lot of thoughts around this, but the primary in a lot of the research that I've done that seems to permeate, these 6 seem to permeate across much of the literature. And many of these are going to look familiar, right? So the first is unsustainable workload, just having too much to do, too much on your plate. The second is a perceived lack of control. And I want to highlight the word perceived here because it's really important. Oftentimes, it's not actually that somebody doesn't have control over the situation that they're in, or over at least influencing the situation that they're in, but it feels that way. And it's that perception that's created by the situation, by the environment that person is operating in. Number 3 is insufficient rewards for effort. I'm doing a ton. I'm not being recognized for it appropriately. Number 4, lack of a supportive community. This one, I like to talk about in terms of, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like I'm in an inclusive environment where people really care about me, where people have my back and I have their back? Do we have shared accountability as a team and as an organization, or do we focus on blame and shame? Number 5, lack of fairness. So do you understand? A really good example on this one is, do you understand how your peers are being promoted? So does it make sense why people are getting rewarded over others? Why some people are getting particular projects over others. And then mismatched values and skills, which is a particularly tough one to address if it's not specifically and explicitly identified. What are the principles that the organization holds? How do those principles match up with the values that the individual employee holds? And are the skills of the job required matching with the skills of the person who's filling that job? So I'd like you to just take a look at these for a minute. What connections do you see? What stands out to you? One thing that really stands out to me is that all of these causes, every single one, is largely the result of external factors. And yet when employees raise concerns related to these causes of burnout, they're often told to take individual action. So I'd like you to take just a minute and look at this slide. We've got the 6 primary causes of burnout on the left there. We've got what employees might say when they're bringing up a concern related to each of those causes in the center column. And on the right, what I would say is a pretty typical response from managers, from leaders. I have way too much on my plate. Let's try to get you to do a little bit better on the time management. I don't agree with how we're making decisions. You don't have all the context. I need to be appropriately compensated. You got to perform at the next level before you can get a promo. I don't feel like my peers or my manager have my back. Well, it's really important for you to take responsibility for your own work, to be accountable for your own actions. I don't understand why some people are promoted over others. Don't compare yourself to others. I need more direct, honest feedback. Let's take a look at how you're performing against the expectations of your role. If these are the responses that you're getting when you raise a concern, how are you going to feel? What does that do to your motivation, to your engagement, and to your trust in the system around you? For so long, employees were told to look inward and to focus on what they could personally control when faced with workplace dissatisfaction. And there's certainly more than a grain of truth to that, right? Like, of course, it's important to look at your own role in a negative situation and to think about what you could do differently to influence the outcome. 1000%. Of course, self-awareness, I'm all about it. We need to be taking responsibility. We need to be looking at how we can personally influence the situations and the environments around us. But we took it too far, in my opinion. We were so focused on telling employees to own their careers and to own their development and to own their mistakes that we gave managers and senior leaders permission to not own much of anything. There's a really phenomenal talent management, I would call her talent management guru. Her name's Lauren Turek, and she runs this consultancy, Let's Do What Matters. And Lauren talks a lot publicly about how leaders and managers are abdicating their responsibility for supporting and developing their teams in the name of autonomy, and how the systems that are in place have allowed that abdication to spiral out of control. That was a light bulb for me. I couldn't agree more with that assessment. There is a big difference between autonomy and abandonment. And I don't think that we have struck the right balance when it comes to getting employees to exercise autonomy, to take responsibility, and to provide supportive environments of shared accountability and psychological safety. But Lauren's not the only one talking about this stuff. So I mentioned earlier that there's this phenomenal study out of the McKinsey Health Institute, recently released, super comprehensive, and they're talking about employee burnout and its causes. And the primary question is, are we solving the right problem? And I'm sure you can figure out by now what my answer to that is, right? Like, my answer is no, we're not solving the right problem in the majority of cases. The major finding of this study was that the leading cause of burnout is a toxic work environment. It's toxic workplace behavior that are causing and leading to these negative outcomes like burnout, like intent to leave. And it wasn't just toxic work behavior, wasn't just at the top of the list. It wasn't just the main driver. It beat out every other factor that they measured by a mile. You're going to get these slides afterwards. And I would highly encourage you to take a look and to take a look at the full study. It's just fantastic. It's really worth it. There are some pretty heavy hitters on this list. It's not like they were measuring how much extra vacation days versus toxic burnout, or how many on-site meditation rooms a company puts in versus toxic workplace behavior. They were looking at things like sustainable workload, like inclusivity, like a supportive growth environment that prioritizes learning, right? They were looking at freedom from bias. These are major things. And as you can see, that dark line in each one of those columns, that's toxic workplace behavior. And the portion of that negative outcome, burnout, intent to leave, distress, the portion of that outcome that toxic workplace behavior contributes. This graph is just staggering to me. The impact of toxicity in the workplace literally couldn't be more clear. And yet many of our organizations are still pushing time management courses, free meditation apps, well-being retreats as true burnout solutions. Now, I don't want to miscategorize these points. Don't get me wrong. There's value in all that stuff. I used to facilitate a women's well-being retreat for senior leaders at Google, and I saw how powerful and transformative it was for so many of our participants. And I also saw what happened to women who returned to toxic teams after going through the retreat. They tried for a while, but like clockwork, they either stopped trying and fell into the same unsustainable patterns, or I was eventually BCC'd on yet another off to my next adventure email. It's not that the massages and the extra vacation time and the job sharing and the meditation and the wellness retreats and the self-reflection, it's not that any of those things are bad. They just aren't enough. So if that's not what we do, let's talk a little bit, about what we do. So to solve burnout, to truly solve it, I believe that we need systemic change. Those individual actions will only take us so far. There's a place for self-care. I don't know where I'd be without it, but it can't be the only solution. Self-improvement is fantastic. It's how I spend the majority of my time, whether it's with myself or with my clients, but systemic organizational change is what's required to truly solve organizational burnout. So let's take a look at what that looks like. If you've heard me speak before, you know that I believe that the future of work is no longer the future. It's here. And along with it, the rules of leadership and people management and how we support teams and how we guide teams and how we inspire followership and inspire action and engagement and motivation within our teams, all of those rules have changed. I believe that much of our struggle to combat workplace toxicity and to solve burnout is rooted in our struggle to let go of what the status quo used to be when it comes to leadership and management. So I've identified 5 shifts that leaders can individually make within themselves, within their teams, in order to influence collective systemic change within their organizations. Some of these are shifts in mindsets. Others are shifts in practice, but they're all centered around creating more supportive, psychologically safe, high-performing teams. So the first one is to reframe our purpose. So this is an exercise in going inward, right? First and foremost, we need to redefine what it means to be a leader. And there's a lot of talk about this, right? This isn't new. We've been talking about this for a solid 5 years. What is a leader's purpose? What do they contribute? What value do they bring? And how has it shifted in the way that the workplace functions today versus the way that it functioned 20, 30 years ago, or let's say 60 years ago or 100 years ago, when the current and I would say most pervasive vision of what a leader does was actually developed. As the world gets more complex and work gets more complex, nuanced, and unpredictable right along with it, the days of monitoring employees' work and barking orders are squarely in the rearview mirror, right? We know this. We need to reframe from manager to coach, from organizer to connector. Leaders often put so much pressure on themselves to know everything, to always have the answer, and to be the grand architect of their teams, because that's what we've always done. But it's time that we shift that perspective, that we get really comfortable with being a guide and not being an owner. We've heard it, we've talked about it, it's time to do it. And I believe the blocker for many of us is within, reframing our purpose within our own minds, shifting that mindset. That's what hasn't happened. Okay, so next, control. We need to release control as leaders and as managers. I believe that control is the biggest thing standing in our way of most things at work. We believe that by monitoring, tracking, checking in, reporting back, that we're keeping things moving, but in reality, we are slowing them down immensely. It's not that transparency into the work is a bad thing. It's actually a really good thing. But when you're spending an inordinate amount of time talking about and reporting on progress instead of getting the work done, then you're probably in a system that relies too heavily on control. A culture centered around control, around asking for permission versus operating within minimal constraints, not only slows things down, it stifles creativity, it zaps energy, and it decreases engagement. In short, it destroys intrinsic motivation, and it creates the conditions where toxic workplace behavior and burnout can thrive. Control and permission-based cultures also create a vicious cycle for themselves. You put systems of control in place, which creates lower engagement and motivation, which decreases the quality and sustainability of your results, which then requires, in our minds, more systems of control, which further decreases engagement and motivation, creates even more poor quality results, and then we're back to putting more systems of control into place. It's tragic. Some leaders are aware that they're overdoing it when it comes to control mechanisms, but some feel like they have no other choice because of the way that the system functions around them. And some leaders are truly unaware. So this particular shift spans the gamut. It's a mindset shift. If you think that control is helping to speed things up and to keep your team organized and productive, you're wrong. and we need to shift that mindset. If it's that you're just lacking the courage to take action because of the system around you, then we need to figure out how you see that broader system. You see those opportunities for influencing change within that system. And if it's that you just don't know how to implement some of these things, then it's a tactical shift. So it spans all of those areas, but it's super central for actually creating these psychologically safe systems where burnout just can't survive. Okay, next. Trust by default. I talk about trust a lot. There's something incredibly powerful that happens when people feel trusted. People are more engaged, they're more innovative, they meet their commitments, and they produce higher quality work. People do a better job when they feel like they're trusted versus when they feel like they're monitored. So this ties right in to that previous point around releasing control. There's a metric ton of research to back this up, but it's also just common sense, right? Like, think about your own experience. Are you more motivated to do good work when you're given the space and the confidence, or when you're being watched? There's a freedom that comes with trusting first, both for the employee and for the leader. There's no pressure to prove that you're trustworthy, and there's no fear that the trust will be withdrawn as soon as you make a mistake. And then that trust is returned from the employee to the leader or the manager. Trust, and particularly trust extended by leadership and extended by default, is a key factor in creating a psychologically safe environment. We know all of this. We just don't talk about the fact that trust is the number one thing. And you got to look, right? You got to look at all the systems in place and figure out Where is there mistrust? Where is there a system based on monitoring, based on control, based on checking in that isn't about moving the work forward? It's about making us feel better about how the work is moving forward. And that's where you need to change policies and processes to make sure that they are rooted in trust. Performance management processes is a prime example, and also project management. Those are prime examples of where trust is often pushed to the sidelines. Stakeholder management. That's another really good one, to take a look at your policies and your norms around stakeholder management and figure out if they're rooted in trust. Okay, build a shared understanding. I'm going to move through this one a little bit quick. It sounds simple. Document stuff, write it down, write it down together and agree to it. But the number of teams that don't do it is really staggering, because documenting your decisions and writing down how things work with your team, it can truly do wonders to clarify how you work, to add confidence into your culture. But we often don't take the time to do it because we think that people just know. People just know how things work around here. But the reality is that they don't. And hidden misunderstandings can have an outsized impact on toxicity at work. As humans, our brains have this pesky habit of always assuming the worst when there are gaps in our understanding of a situation. We're exceptionally good at scenario building, about treating our assumptions as grounded facts and over-indexing on negative inputs in our environment, which then skews our interpretation of a situation and the relationships around us. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, in a toxic workplace environment where none of the team's decisions or processes or norms are written down, our brains just go bananas. And they start filling in gaps with all kinds of unsubstantiated, overblown, worst case scenarios, because that's what we're wired to do. I'm sure you've heard this before, but if there's a low growl in the bushes and you can't see what's making the noise, you're probably not going to assume the best intent, and go check it out. You're probably going to assume the worst and run away from something that could very well be a tiger that's waiting to eat you. The simple construct, but it's one that we continually forget, because we think, oh, it's okay. If we don't write this stuff down, then I'm sure people know. They know that we're supportive. They know all this stuff. They don't know. And they fill in the gaps with the absolute worst like possible scenario of what could possibly be going on. And then that leads to mistrust. We fill in the gaps with the fear of more tigers. Okay. So finally, focus on learning. Blame and shame is out. Things go wrong. There's no getting around it. And how leaders react in those moments really matters. When everything's going great, it's easy to be compassionate, to be curious, to be focused on learning and growth. But it's when it hits the fan, right? When circumstances are at their worst, that leaders need to show up at their best. That's when we need to bring that extra helping of compassion to the table, to show people that they aren't being measured or judged by every mistake that they make. And that's when it's the hardest to do. We need to adopt a beginner's mindset when it comes to leadership, a mindset that doesn't position leaders as experts that are incapable of imperfection, but that position everyone on the team, leaders included, as people who are fallible, who are going to make mistakes, and who are going to support each other, who are going to guide each other, who are going to lift each other up when stuff goes sideways. Leadership and is so focused on learning. We've made that shift in the way that we approach how we develop leaders, but we need to make an even more intentional shift in the way that we develop leaders to develop and nurture their teams. Okay. So to end for today, I love this quote. I end pretty much all of my talks with this quote. This is Wilma Rudolph. She was a record-breaking track and field 1960 Olympic champion and just an incredibly wise woman. And she said, never underestimate the power of dreams and the influence of the human spirit. We are all the same in this notion. The potential for greatness lives within each of us. A leader's job is to bring out the greatness in every employee. And that's simply not possible in an environment where toxic behavior is tolerated. In unsafe environments, employees will retreat. They'll shift into survival mode, fight, flight, or freeze. And isn't that kind of what we've been seeing over the last 6 months? If you think about it, 6 months ago, we were talking about the Great Resignation. That was the big or reset or pick your favorite R word, right? Doesn't matter. It's the same thing that's happening. We were talking about that, and that was the great employee engagement trend. 6 weeks ago, believe it or not, it was just 6 weeks ago, we were talking about quiet quitting. And I kid you not, 6 days ago from today, I saw my first article on quick quitting. These trends aren't going to stop. They're going to keep accelerating. There will be more of them until leadership and actually listens to what employees want and what they need. Trusting, transparent, and toxicity-free environments. But here's the good news. If we can do that, if we can create safe environments where employees can raise concerns, where they can ask for help, they can lean on each other without the fear of judgment or blame, I believe that we can create highly sustainable, highly productive. Can you imagine the productivity gains that we saw from remote work during the pandemic paired with actual psych safety? I believe that we can create highly sustainable, productive workplaces that go far beyond anything that we've ever experienced. But we have to take the leap, and that's going to require a mindset shift and acceptance that the very fabric of work, the workplace, and the way that we define leadership has already changed. The reality is that a lot of us think that we're preparing for the future. We talk about future of work. We're really just playing catch up. The situation is already here. So in closing, I'd like to encourage you to think about what's really standing in your way when it comes to workplace toxicity and addressing the systemic issues that are fueling employee burnout in your organization. And then I want you to go out and have an honest conversation with the people who can remove those barriers. Because quite frankly, folks, I truly believe that there is no time to lose. It's here and it's waiting for us to do something about it. Thank you all so much. Always a pleasure. And I'm excited to talk with you all later at the Colleague Cafe. Thank you.